If you want to know the truth, there is nothing more depressing than a wealthy family's New Year's Eve party. It is all fake laughter, and people in stiff tuxedos acting like they aren't miserable just to impress people they despise. It kills me. My name is Ella Willis, and I was the invisible girl in the corner. I worked like a dog for my master's degree, but my parents acted like I didn't exist. They were too busy handing my grandmother's emerald, my promised legacy, to my brother's gold-digging girlfriend, just to show off. It was the most pathetic display of phoniness I ever witnessed. Before I tell you how I made them pay, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The story begins in the freezing cold foyer of my parents' house moments before the facade crumbled. The air inside the Willis estate was always colder than the winter wind outside, a chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat and everything to do with the people who lived there. It was New Year's Eve, and the sprawling downstairs ballroom was already thick with the scent of expensive pine imported lilies and the cloying perfume of my parents' social circle. I stood in the shadow of a massive marble pillar near the entrance, clutching a navy blue leather folder against my chest, so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Inside that folder was a master's degree in education, a piece of paper that represented 2 years of sleepless nights scrimping on ramen noodles and working as a teaching assistant to pay my own tuition, because my father claimed his money was tied up in more important ventures. I had driven 3 hours through sleet to be here, foolishly hoping that tonight, amidst the celebration of a new year, my family might finally celebrate me. I took a deep breath, smoothing the skirt of my modest black dress, and stepped into the light. My mother, Eleanor, was by the buffet table, critically rearranging a platter of smoked salmon. My father, Richard, stood near the fireplace, swirling a tumbler of scotch, while laughing loudly at something my brother Kyle had said. Kyle. He looked every inch the prodigal son, wearing a tuxedo that cost more than my car. His hair gelled back in that slick, arrogant style he thought made him look like a CEO. In reality, he was 26, unemployed, and currently burning through our parents' retirement fund on a series of failed startups that were little more than expensive hobbies. Mom, Dad. I approached them, my voice sounding smaller than I intended against the din of jazz music and chatter. They didn't turn. I stepped closer, intruding on their circle. I have news. The final grades posted yesterday. I graduated, with honors. I held the folder out slightly, a silent offering. My mother glanced at me, her eyes flicking over my dress with a familiar disapproval before landing on my face. There was no smile, no warmth, just a frantic checking of her diamond wristwatch. "Not now, Ella," she hissed, waving her hand as if shooing away a fly. "Kyle's girlfriend is arriving any minute. Tiffany. We need to make a good impression. She comes from money, real money, not the kind we have to manage carefully. Do you know her father owns half the commercial real estate in the city?" "But Mom, I finished my degree," I said, the desperation leaking into my tone. "I thought maybe we could—" "Ella, please." My father cut in, his voice booming with that jovial dismissiveness he reserved for me. "Don't clutter the evening with your little projects. Kyle is about to close a major deal with this girl. Do not embarrass him by making this about you. Grab a tray if you want to be useful." The stinging heat of humiliation rose up my neck. My little project was a career, a future. But before I could defend myself, the heavy oak front doors swung open. A hush fell over the room as Kyle practically sprinted to the entryway. Tiffany had arrived. She was undeniably striking, dressed in a shimmering silver gown that was cut too low and slit too high for a family gathering, dripping in costume jewelry that caught the light. She walked in, not like a guest, but like she already owned the deed to the house. She was loud, brash, and possessed a laugh that grated on the ears like shattering glass, but my parents beamed as if royalty had entered the room. I watched from the periphery as they fawned over her. Kyle was parading her around, introducing her to business associates while she barely made eye contact, her gaze constantly darting around the room, assessing the value of the paintings and the furniture. It was a transaction, not a romance, and everyone seemed to know it except my parents, who were blinded by the dollar signs attached to her last name. Then came the moment that shattered whatever fragile hope I had left. My father cleared his throat, calling for the room's attention. "Everyone, a moment please. We have a special welcome for a special guest." He gestured to Tiffany, who feigned surprise with a theatrical hand over her mouth. My mother stepped forward holding a black velvet box. My heart stopped. I knew that box. It was worn at the corners, smelling faintly of lavender and old memories. "This," my father announced, his voice thick with pride, "was my mother's most prized possession. Grandmother Rose meant for this to be passed down to the woman who would carry the family legacy forward." I couldn't breathe. My feet were rooted to the Persian rug. Grandmother Rose had held my hand on her deathbed 5 years ago. She had whispered to me, "Ella, my emerald brooch. It's for you. Not for your wedding, but for your graduation. When you earn your way in the world, you wear my stone. It symbolizes wisdom." It was our secret pact. My parents knew this. They knew. My mother opened the box. Nestled inside, glowing under the chandelier light, was the massive emerald brooch, surrounded by a halo of diamonds. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a stunning piece of history, heavy and ancient. "Tiffany," my father said, beaming, "we want you to have this, as a token of our affection and future expectations." Tiffany squealed a high-pitched sound of greed and reached for it. "Oh my God, it's huge. Is it real?" "Of course it's real." My father laughed, pinning it onto her shimmering dress. I couldn't stop myself. I stepped forward, my voice trembling. "Dad, Grandma Rose promised that to me, for my graduation." The room went silent. Tiffany looked at me for the first time, her lip curling in a sneer. "And who is this?" she asked Kyle, as if I were the hired help. My father turned to me, his face hardening into a mask of annoyance. He didn't look ashamed. He looked irritated that I had interrupted the theater. "Ella, don't be petty," he said loud enough for the guests nearby to hear. "Tiffany is the future of this family. Besides, you wouldn't appreciate its value. You're too simple. You'd probably lose it or sell it to buy books. This jewel belongs on a woman who understands prestige." Simple. The word hung in the air like smoke. My mother wouldn't even meet my eyes. She was too busy adjusting the clasp on Tiffany's chest, ensuring it sat perfectly. Kyle smirked at me, a look of pure triumph. "Go get a drink, Elle. You're ruining the vibe." I looked at the brooch one last time. It looked wrong on her. It looked tainted. The promise was broken, the contract violated. I clutched my diploma folder tighter, the sharp edge digging into my palm, grounding me. I didn't scream. I didn't flip a table. A cold, heavy resolve settled in my chest, replacing the heartbreak. They had made their choice. They had traded my lifetime of loyalty and achievement for a shiny object and a stranger's approval. I turned on my heel, the sound of Tiffany's performative laughter ringing in my ears, and walked out of the ballroom, heading straight for the dark quiet of the library. They thought I was simple. They thought I didn't understand value. I was about to teach them just how wrong they were. The library was the only room in the house that still felt like it belonged to the past, smelling of dust leather binding and the lemon polish Grandmother Rose used to favor. I collapsed into one of the wingback chairs near the unlit fireplace, finally letting the tears fall. They were hot and angry, fueled by a mixture of grief for the grandmother I missed and hatred for the family I was stuck with. I felt foolish, clutching my diploma like a shield that had failed to protect me. I was just about to bury my face in my hands when a sharp, rhythmic tapping sound cut through my sobbing. Tap, tap, tap. I looked up, startled, wiping my eyes. Emerging from the shadows of the history section was Mrs. Agnes Higgins. She was 82 years old, draped in a vintage velvet shawl that had seen better decades, leaning on a cane with a handle carved into the shape of a hawk's head. Agnes had been Rose's best friend for 50 years, a woman who played bridge like a general commanding troops and suffered no fools. I hadn't even realized she was invited. My mother usually tried to hide the geriatrics, as she called them, in the sunroom. Agnes didn't offer a tissue. She didn't coo or offer empty platitudes. Instead, she hobbled closer, her eyes bright and piercing behind thick spectacles. "Stop crying, Ella," she commanded, her voice raspy but firm. "It doesn't suit you. And besides, Rose knew this would happen. She knew your parents were dazzled by fool's gold." I sniffled, confused. "What are you talking about, Mrs. Higgins? They gave away her brooch, the one she promised me." Agnes scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound. She reached into her oversized beaded handbag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax. She held it out to me. "Rose was a lot of things, dear, but she wasn't naive. She knew your father is a weak man, and your mother is a vain woman. She knew that if she left the emerald in the house, it would be sold or bartered away for social standing long before you donned a cap and gown." I took the envelope. My name was written on the front in Rose's shaky but elegant script. My hands trembled as I broke the wax seal. Inside was a heavy brass key and a letter on thick stationery. I unfolded the paper, and it was like hearing her voice again. "My dearest Ella," the letter began. "If you are reading this, two things have happened. First, you have graduated. I am so proud of you. Second, your parents have tried to give my emerald brooch to someone else. Do not despair." The item in the velvet box, the one currently being paraded around by whatever flavor of the month your brother has dragged home, is a paste replica. I had it commissioned in 1998. It is high-quality glass set in plated brass. It is worthless. I gasped, looking up at Agnes. A mischievous smile played on the old woman's lips. "She paid $50 for the copy," Agnes whispered conspiratorially. "She said it was the best insurance policy she ever bought." I looked back down at the letter. "The real emerald," it continued, "is in safety deposit box 404 at the First National Bank downtown. This key opens it. However, the bank has strict instructions. The box can only be accessed by Ella Willis upon presentation of a university diploma. The legacy belongs to the builder, not the spender. Now go wipe your face and claim what is yours." The weight of the brass key in my hand felt grounding real. The tears dried instantly, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. "It's fake," I whispered, the realization blooming into a dark sense of satisfaction. "Tiffany is wearing a piece of glass." Agnes nodded. "And looking quite smug about it, too. Now the question is, what are we going to do? If we tell them now, they'll just deny it and hide the fake." "I don't just want the brooch back," I said, my voice hardening. "I want them to know. I want them to feel what I felt." Agnes's eyes twinkled. "That's my girl. We don't steal it back. We make them appraise it." We began to hatch a plan right there in the dim light of the library. We needed to expose the fraud publicly, making it impossible for my parents to spin the narrative. But our strategizing was cut short by the sound of voices in the hallway. I signaled for Agnes to be quiet. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, and I could hear Kyle's booming, intoxicated voice. "Telling you, man, it's in the bag. The old man gave her the rock, so she's practically locked in. I'm going to do it tonight. Right at midnight. I'll propose with the brooch. It saves me buying a ring, and once she's wearing it as a fiancé, Dad says we can leverage her dad's portfolio for the startup capital." My blood ran cold. He was going to propose. If Kyle proposed and Tiffany accepted, she would leave with the heirloom on her finger. Once she was out of the house, recovering the fake and proving the humiliation would be impossible. The narrative would just be that I was jealous. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was 11:15 p.m. We had 45 minutes before the ball dropped. 45 minutes before Kyle cemented his fraud with a proposal. "We have to move," I hissed to Agnes. "If he proposes, the game is over." Agnes gripped her cane, straightening her spine with a surprising amount of vigor. "Then we better crash the party, dear, and we better be dramatic about it." I helped her up, tucking the letter and the key safely into my pocket. The sadness was gone, entirely replaced by a cold, tactical clarity. I wasn't just the ignored daughter anymore, I was the holder of the truth. We walked toward the door, an unlikely pair, the overlooked graduate and the underestimated octogenarian, ready to turn their celebration into a reckoning. The hallway was empty, the noise from the party swelling as we approached. I checked my reflection in the glass of a bookcase. I looked fierce. "Ready?" I asked Agnes. She winked. "I've been waiting 20 years for this, darling. Lead the way." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the half-hour marks, signaling 11:30 p.m. as Agnes and I stepped back into the ballroom. The atmosphere had shifted from polite mingling to a raucous champagne-fueled loudness. The air was thick with body heat and expensive cologne, a sensory assault that would have made me shrink back an hour ago. Now it just sharpened my focus. I walked differently, my spine rigid, the navy folder gone and the letter tucked securely into my pocket, my hand brushing against it like a talisman. Agnes moved beside me with a surprising predatory grace, her cane tapping a steady, ominous rhythm on the hardwood floor that seemed to cut through the jazz bass line. We stopped at the edge of the dance floor, watching the tableau of my family's deceit. Kyle was standing on a raised platform near the DJ booth, flushed and sweating, holding a microphone in one hand and a magnum of champagne in the other. Tiffany stood next to him, preening the fake emerald brooch, catching the strobe lights, and flashing a brilliant, deceitful green. "Ladies and gentlemen!" Kyle bellowed, his voice booming over the speakers, causing a feedback whine that made several guests wince. "If I could have your attention, we're 30 minutes away from the new year and I want to make a toast. To family, to legacy." He draped a heavy arm around Tiffany, who beamed a practiced smile at the crowd. My parents stood in the front row looking up at them with the adoration of worshippers before an idol. "Tonight isn't just about the calendar turning," Kyle continued, his chest puffing out. "It's about securing the future. You see this jewel on this beautiful woman." He pointed a finger at the brooch on Tiffany's chest. "This isn't just jewelry. This is the Willis family legacy, a rock-solid proof of our fortune passed down from my grandmother to the new generation. It's worth a fortune, but the history priceless." The crowd murmured appreciatively, a ripple of oohs and ahs washing over the room. My father nodded vigorously, raising his glass. "A fortune!" Agnes's voice cracked through the room, not amplified by a microphone, but projected with the stage-trained clarity of a woman who had commanded boardrooms in the 70s. "For that piece of glass!" The silence that followed was instant and absolute. The DJ killed the music. Kyle blinked, looking down into the crowd, squinting against the spotlight. "Who said that?" Agnes stepped forward into the pool of light, her cane hitting the floor with a final decisive thud. "I did, you foolish boy." My mother let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, rushing toward us. "Agnes, good heavens, you must be tired. It's past your bedtime." "Kyle, ignore her, she's confused. She's senile." She tried to grab Agnes's elbow to steer her away, but Agnes shrugged her off with shocking strength. "I am many things, Eleanor, but I am not senile, and I am certainly not a liar." Agnes reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver folding object. A jeweler's loop. A collective gasp went through the older guests, who recognized the tool. Agnes had been a certified gemologist in her youth, a fact my parents had conveniently forgotten or perhaps never cared to know. She turned her gaze to Tiffany. "If that stone is the family legacy," Agnes said, her voice dripping with challenge, "surely you wouldn't mind an old woman admiring the craftsmanship. If it's real, you have nothing to fear from a little magnification." Tiffany hesitated, her hand flying up to cover the brooch protectively. I don't think that's necessary," she stammered, looking at Kyle for help. "It's rude." But the damage was done. The guests were whispering. The challenge had been issued publicly. If she refused, it looked suspicious. If she accepted, she was doomed. My father stepped in, his face red. "This is absurd, Agnes, put that toy away." "Let her look," a voice called out from the back. It was Mr. Henderson, the bank manager. "If it's the Rose Willis Emerald, it's famous. Let's see the hallmark." The pressure was palpable. Tiffany, sensing the mood turning against her, let out a huff of annoyance. "Fine," she snapped, unclasping the brooch with jerky, angry movements. "Look at it. It's heavy enough." She thrust the brooch into Agnes's hand. Agnes took it, holding it up to the light. She unfolded the loop and brought it to her eye, squinting. The room held its breath. I watched my parents. The color was draining from their faces. They didn't know it was fake, they just feared Agnes finding a flaw. But the truth was far worse. Agnes lowered the loop slowly. She looked at Tiffany, then at my parents, and then she threw her head back and laughed, a dry, cackling sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "Oh, Rose," she chuckled. "You old fox." She held the brooch up high. "It's a very nice piece of theater," Agnes announced to the room. "But the setting is plated brass, and the stone it's paste, high-quality glass. I'd value it at maybe $50 on a good day at a flea market." "You lie," my father roared, charging forward. "That is an heirloom. It is a decoy." I shouted, stepping out from behind Agnes. My voice didn't tremble this time. I pulled the letter from my pocket and unfolded it. "Grandmother Rose knew you would do this. She knew you would try to buy influence with her memory." I held up the paper. "This is her final letter, dated 3 weeks before she died." I began to read, my voice ringing out clearly in the silent ballroom. "To my son and his wife, if you are reading this, you gave the decoy to someone based on greed, proving you care more for appearances than integrity. The brooch in the velvet box is a fake." I looked up. My mother was clutching her pearls, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. I continued reading. "To Ella, if you are reading this, you earned your degree. You put in the work while others played. The real emerald is in a safety deposit box at First National, accessible only by you upon presentation of your diploma. The real legacy belongs to the one with the discipline to build a future." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The guests turned to look at my parents with a mixture of pity and disgust. They had been exposed not just as cheap, but as morally bankrupt, willing to bypass their daughter's achievement to impress a stranger with a fake gift. But the most volatile reaction came from the stage. Tiffany stood frozen, her eyes wide as she processed the information. She looked at the cheap, glittering thing in Agnes's hand, then at the letter in mine, and finally at Kyle. The realization washed over her face. The family had no access to the grandmother's fortune. The wealth Kyle bragged about was a mirage, and she had almost engaged herself to a pauper with a piece of glass. "You told me it was worth 50,000, Tiffany whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "You told me you had access to the trust fund." "Babe, wait, it's a mistake," Kyle stammered, reaching for her. "Don't touch me," she screamed. She snatched the fake brooch from Agnes's hand, not to keep it, but to weaponize it. "You liar! You broke loser!" She hurled the brooch at Kyle with all her might. It struck him in the chest and clattered to the floor, a hollow, tinny sound that confirmed everything Agnes had said. The precious heirloom bounced across the parquet floor and spun to a stop at my father's feet. Tiffany ripped the microphone stand down, knocking over a monitor with a crash. "I'm leaving, and don't you dare follow me." The climax wasn't a proposal, it was a demolition. And as Tiffany stormed off the stage, leaving my brother humiliated and my parents exposed, I felt a calm, quiet victory settle in my bones. The truth was out, and it was brighter than any diamond. The echo of the fake brooch hitting the floor seemed to linger in the air, long after the metal had stopped spinning. For a moment, the ballroom was paralyzed, a tableau of ruin illuminated by the harsh glare of the stage lights. Then the silence shattered. Tiffany didn't just leave. She scorched the earth beneath my brother's feet. She stood at the edge of the stage, her chest heaving, her perfectly manicured finger pointing accusingly at Kyle, who looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar. "I should have listened to my father," she shrieked, her voice cracking with a mix of fury and embarrassment. "He told me you were a fraud. He told me you were leveraging your parents' name to get lines of credit you couldn't pay back." Kyle tried to step forward, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Tiffany, baby. It's just a misunderstanding. I have the capital coming in next quarter. But she cut him off with a laugh that was devoid of any humor. Capital. You don't even have gas money, Kyle. I paid the lease on that ridiculous sports car last month because your card was declined. I paid for the dinner at Le Monde. I was floating you because I thought this— She gestured wildly at the room at the house at the lie of it all— was real. I thought I was investing in a dynasty, not bailing out a charity case. The guests, the cream of the city's social elite, were no longer politely looking away. They were staring hungry for the carnage. I saw Mrs. Vanderhoven, the head of the charity board. My mother was desperate to join, lean over to her husband, and whisper loudly enough to be heard 3 rows back. Paying his car lease. Good Lord, I thought they had liquidity. And giving a fake heirlooms. How common. My parents, who had spent 30 years carefully curating an image of effortless old money, were watching their reputation disintegrate in real time. My father's face was a mottled purple, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. My mother looked as if she were about to faint, her eyes darting between the exit and the guests, realizing there was no way to spin this. They had been exposed not just as cheap, but as frauds. They had insulted the intelligence of a wealthy potential in-law and in doing so had revealed their own financial desperation. Tiffany wasn't finished. She ripped the corsage from her wrist and threw it down to join the fake brooch. We are done, Kyle. Don't call me. And if you come near my apartment, my father will have you arrested for harassment. He knows about the business loan you asked him for yesterday, too. Consider that rejected. With a final dramatic swirl of her silver gown, she stormed through the parted crowd, the guests moving aside like the Red Sea to let her pass. The slamming of the heavy front doors moments later felt like a gavel coming down on a guilty verdict. Kyle stood alone on the stage, the microphone hanging limply in his hand, stripped of his arrogance, revealed as exactly what he was, a 26-year-old child playing dress-up. Then the energy in the room shifted. My parents, realizing the Tiffany option was dead and buried, turned their heads slowly toward me. I could see the gears turning in their panic-stricken minds. They had lost the wealthy daughter-in-law, but the letter I held, the letter from Grandmother Rose, proved there was still an asset in play. A real asset. The emerald in the safety deposit box. The greed that replaced the shock on my mother's face made my stomach turn. She smoothed her dress, plastered on a trembling, terrifyingly fake smile, and began to walk toward me. Ella, she crooned, her voice pitching up into that sickly sweet register she used when she wanted a favor. Ella, darling. She reached out her hands, fluttering toward my arms, trying to bridge the physical distance I had put between us. Oh, thank goodness you saved us from that awful girl. Did you see how she reacted? Just trashy? You were right to intervene. Grandmother Rose always had such unique timing. I took a step back, ensuring her hands grabbed nothing but empty air. Unique timing, I repeated, my voice steady. She called you out from the grave, Mom. She knew you'd trade her memory for social climbing. Now let's not be dramatic, my father interjected, stepping up beside my mother, trying to regain his patriarchal composure despite the sweat beading on his forehead. He cleared his throat, attempting to lower his voice so the eavesdropping guests wouldn't hear the negotiation. The important thing is that the heirloom, the real heirloom, is safe. That's a relief to all of us. Good work, Ella. He reached for my shoulder, a gesture of ownership. Monday morning, first thing, we'll go down to the bank together. We'll get the box open, and we'll put the emerald in the family safe here at the house where it belongs. It needs to be insured under the main policy, of course. The audacity was breathtaking. 5 minutes ago, I was simple and unworthy of the legacy. Now that I was the gatekeeper to the fortune, I was darling and part of the we. They didn't want me. They wanted the key in my pocket. They wanted to take the emerald locket away and probably sell it quietly in 6 months to cover Kyle's debts, telling me it was for the good of the family. No, I said. It wasn't a shout, but it cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. My father blinked, his smile faltering. "Excuse me." I said no. I repeated, standing taller than I ever had in my life. "We aren't going to the bank together. I am going to the bank. The letter is a legal testament. The contents of Box 404 are mine. Solely mine. Not the family's. Mine." "Ella, be reasonable," my mother hissed, her smile dropping to reveal the snarl beneath. "You are a school teacher. You can't possibly manage an asset like that. You don't have the lifestyle for it. It belongs to the estate." "It belongs to the graduate," I corrected her, tapping the pocket where my diploma lay. "And frankly, considering you just tried to give a piece of green glass to a gold digger, I don't think you're in any position to lecture me on asset management." My father's face darkened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You ungrateful child. You are living under my roof." "Actually," Agnes interrupted, stepping smoothly between my father and me. She adjusted her shawl, looking at my parents with the cold, hard gaze of a judge delivering a life sentence. "If you are thinking of contesting the will or bullying the girl Richard, I wouldn't recommend it." She pulled her smartphone from her handbag, a modern device that looked incongruous in her ancient hands. "I recorded the entire interaction, the presentation of the fake your admission that you gave it away, and the reading of the letter. And as you know, my nephew is the senior partner at Henderson, Clark and Stein. He handles Rose's estate." She tapped the phone screen. "He's already received the video file. If you try to stop Ella from accessing that box, or if you harass her in any way, he has instructions to release the footage to the local press. Prominent family frauds guests with fake jewelry." Can you imagine the headlines? The board memberships you'd lose. The club invitations that would vanish. My parents froze. The threat was absolute. In their world, reputation was currency, and Agnes had just threatened to bankrupt them. My father looked at the guests who were pretending not to listen, but were clearly hanging on every word. He looked at Kyle, broken on the stage. He looked at me, really looked at me, and realized he had no leverage left. The shame was total. The house of cards hadn't just collapsed, it had been incinerated. "Get out!" My father whispered, his voice trembling with impotent rage. "Gladly," I said. I turned away from them, from the opulence, from the lies. I didn't look back at the parents who had ignored me or the brother who had mocked me. I looked at Agnes, who was grinning like she'd just won the lottery. "Let's go," I told her. The path to the door was wide open, and for the first time in my life, the air in that house didn't feel cold. It felt like I was finally breathing. The grandfather clock in the foyer began to toll again, a deep, resonant sound that marked the arrival of midnight. But inside the Willis ballroom, time seemed to have stopped. Outside, through the French windows, I could see the sky lighting up with the frantic, colorful bursts of fireworks from the country club down the road. Distant pops and whistles filtering in, like the soundtrack to a celebration happening on a different planet. Inside, there was no countdown. No one shouted "Happy New Year." There was only the suffocating weight of a reputation dying in real time. I paused at the archway, my coat over my arm, and took one final look at the wreckage of what I used to call home. It was a scene of perfect poetic devastation. Kyle had collapsed onto the edge of the stage, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his head in his hands, looking every bit the defeated child who had finally been told, no. The guests, the people my parents had spent a lifetime trying to impress, were already retreating. They were checking their phones, whispering behind cupped hands, their eyes darting toward my parents, with a mixture of pity and predatory amusement. The gossip was already spreading. By morning, the story of the fake brooch and the bankrupt son would be the talk of the entire social circuit. My parents stood alone in the center of the dance floor, isolated in a circle of empty space. My mother was holding the fake brooch, turning the cheap brass over and over in her fingers, as if trying to understand how something so shiny could be so worthless. My father had his back to the room, staring into the unlit fireplace. His posture slumped, the illusion of his power stripped away to reveal a frightened aging man who had bet on the wrong child. I felt a tug on my sleeve. "Come along, dear," Agnes said softly, her voice devoid of its earlier sharp edge replaced now by a gentle warmth. "There is nothing left for you here. The show is over." She was right. I adjusted my grip on my diploma folder, feeling the solid, tangible reality of it against my ribs. I walked out of the ballroom, my heels clicking on the marble for the last time. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. My absence was the loudest statement I could make. We retrieved our coats from the cloakroom in silence, the hired staff averting their eyes as if we were walking ghosts. When the heavy front door closed behind us, the silence of the winter night rushed in to greet us, cold and clean and impossibly fresh. The air smelled of snow and wood smoke, scrubbing the scent of stale perfume and desperation from my lungs. I helped Agnes down the front steps, her grip on my arm steady and reassuring. We walked toward my beat-up sedan, which was parked conspicuously between a Bentley and a Porsche, a visual reminder of the world I didn't fit into and no longer wanted to join. "Well," Agnes said, stopping to look up at the fireworks blooming purple and gold against the black sky. "That was certainly one way to ring in the new year. Rose would have absolutely loved it. I think she would have toasted you with her sherry." I unlocked the car door, the beep of the alarm sounding cheerful in the quiet night. "Agnes," I said, pausing with my hand on the handle. "What happens now, I mean? The emerald. I know it's valuable, but I've never had money. Real money. I don't even know where to start." Agnes leaned against the car, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She looked at me, her eyes twinkling with that same ancient wisdom that had guided me through the night. "The appraisal on the real emerald was done 5 years ago, Ella. It's a flawless Colombian stone. It's worth enough to clear your student loans 10 times over. It's worth enough to give you choices." She reached out and patted my cheek with a gloved hand. "But money is just a tool, darling. It's not the victory. The victory is that you walked out of there with your head up." "So what's the first thing I should do?" I asked, looking back at the house. The lights were still on, blazing in every window, a beacon of misery on the hill. Agnes smiled, a genuine soft expression that made her look decades younger. "Sell the stone. Keep the memory, but sell the stone. And then—" she gestured toward the dark open road leading away from the estate. "Buy a house, Ella. A small one. A big one. It doesn't matter. Just buy a house where you don't have to ask for permission to be happy. Buy a front door that only opens for people who respect you." A house where I didn't have to ask for permission to be happy. The words settled deep in my chest, filling the hollow space where my family's approval used to be. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "I will," I promised. "I really will." I helped Agnes into the passenger seat and got in behind the wheel. The engine sputtered to life, a familiar, reliable sound. I put the car in gear and began to drive down the long, winding driveway lined with manicured hedges. As we reached the main gate, I glanced up at the rearview mirror one last time. The Willis estate was shrinking, becoming just a glowing speck in the distance, a dollhouse filled with paper people. I thought about the brooch in the safety deposit box, but more than that, I thought about the diploma on the back seat and the key in my pocket. My parents had wanted to give me a fake inheritance, a life of pretense and performance. Instead, I was leaving with the real thing, the truth, my dignity, and a future that was entirely, undeniably mine. I turned onto the main road, accelerating into the darkness, driving straight toward the dawn of a new year. The road ahead was empty, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of where it might lead. I was free. And so Ella drove off into a future built on her own terms, leaving the fake glitz of her family in the rearview mirror where it belongs. It is a reminder that true value isn't found in jewelry, but in character. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and share your opinion below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.